I think it's time for a long look at the overall state of America. From time to time, I take a step back and survey things in the form of an update to where the country stands at a given moment in time. Neither the current assessment nor the prognosis are good or even improved. America is inexorably sliding downhill. The economics of American collapse say that it's probably too late to fix America. It's probable that this is the new normal. Chaos, decline, incompetence, malice, poverty, hopelessness, despair. Let me explain as clearly as I can. You can see right about now that America is from a pandemic of which 90% are needless. A society that's not able to provide basics for its citizens anymore. A nation in which income, savings, life expectancy, happiness, trust are all in free fall. This is the stuff of epic social collapse. Now, the reason that America collapsed is straightforward. Americans never invested in building expansive social systems like Europe's. Systems to provide healthcare, retirement, childcare, finance, and so on. The result has been twofold. One, the average American now goes without these things. That's because they're largely unavailable. For example, the fresh food that I can get on any block in Europe is simply absent in huge chunks of the States. You pretty much buy processed food, or you don't get food. The same is true of many, many things, like, say, education or income. You don't have a job without guarantees and protections like in Canada or Europe. You have a lower quality, not just quantity of income. 2. The average American pays prices that the rest of the world rightly considers absolutely absurd for the very same things. Having a child? That'll be $50,000, thank you. An operation? That'll be more than a house. Want to educate a kid? There goes. These things, the basics of life, are eminently affordable in the rest of the rich world. In America, though, they cost more than the average person can afford. This is knowable because the average American now dies in debt. His or her whole life is one long sequence of unpayable debts now. First, there's lunch debt, which becomes student debt, which becomes a mortgage and a credit card debt, which becomes medical debt. The forms of debt don't even exist, as I've just described them in most other rich countries. In America, though, they define life precisely because the average American is now a poor person. Debt. The forms of debt don't even exist, as I've just described them in most other rich countries. In America, though, they define life precisely because the average American is now a poor person, in the sense that they can't make ends meet when it comes to paying for the basics of life. Sure, they might have a big car and a big house and a big gun, but the economic truth is this. All those things have been made possible by debt, and the average American now lives as an impoverished person. No savings, no assets, no liquidity. 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, struggle to pay basic bills, and can't raise, say, $500 for an emergency. Those are the statistics that describe can America save itself from collapse? If you really understand the numbers, the answer is probably not. The economics say that America has more or less almost certainly reached the point of no return now, and collapse is inevitable. To stop collapse, America would have to start investing massively, suddenly, historically, in functioning systems. To stop longevity and health cratering, it needs a healthcare system. To stop happiness and trust cratering, it needs affordable education and retirement. To stop incomes and savings plummeting, it needs retirement systems and protections for workers, etc. Every single facet of American collapse requires massive, large-scale, sustained rebound, and that will continue uninterrupted for a decade or more. Many Americans even support that much. They understand by now that without a new social contract, America is finished. Maybe the average American does understand this. Let's allow that much. The tragic wrinkle is that it makes no difference. Even if the majority of Americans want a better America, it's too late to build one. There's no one to pay for it, for starters. Think about those dismal statistics I cited just now. The average American lives the life of a poor person now. So there's nobody to pay for all these expansive new systems. The average person simply can't afford the improvements to society that he or she needs anymore. What happens then? The answer is nothing. More slow, shocking collapse and descent. There's no other option. You see, if I say to average Americans, let's fix America, all you have to do is pay 10% more in taxes, and you'll have world-class healthcare, retirement, childcare, etc. They might even support it wholeheartedly. They might genuinely want it. But the economic reality is that they can't afford it. That 10% is now crucial income. That's what the average American dies in debt tells us. The average person can't give up that 10%. He or she desperately needs it to pay off simple everyday bills. They have no real savings to speak of. So the money to fund the average person can't give up that 10%. He or she desperately needs it to pay off simple everyday bills. They have no real savings to speak of. So the money to fund this wonderful new social contract has nowhere to come from. The bitter truth is this. Americans are now too poor to afford a better social contract. Even if Americans support a Canadian or European-style social contract, the hard economic truth is that they are now too poor ever to have one. Americans are now so poor that they can barely afford to support themselves and their own. 80% live at the edge, so there's no way they can afford to support anyone else, let alone everyone else. That's not just. Americans just rejected their best chance at reform in generations. Bernie and Liz Warren. That was on the left. The 70% or who say they want to decent healthcare, retirement, education, and so on. Only they never, ever vote for it when push comes to shove. Raising the spectre of higher taxes to fund a functioning society is something that simply can't be borne by even those who want it. Nobody can afford it now. Even Americans who say they want a better society don't seem able, predictably, consistently, to follow through now. There's a reason for that. America's too poor as a country to afford to be a functioning society anymore. Government, which indeed they don't, with good reason. It's also that they can't bear any more uncertainty. When your whole life and future seems to be going up in smoke, when you bear all the risk in society, the last thing you can take is even more. So while Bernie and Liz might have pretended to champion a functioning society at the same tax rate, the risk of having to pay for a functioning society is simply now too much for Americans who already live on the edge. If taxes do end up rising by just 5% when you're already perpetually struggling, bang, it's game over. Americans, bang, it's game over. Americans can't afford to bear the risks or costs of fundamental reforms to a broken society, and that seals in collapse as the only trajectory left to follow. On the right, by the way, people are so confused and bewildered that, like the protesters I've just mentioned, they're willing to give up their lives to keep their livelihoods. That's how desperate things have become. See the point? On the left, people might want a functioning society, but never ever vote for it because nobody can afford it, while the right has given up on it altogether, hoping only for the chance to be exploited, just so long as food can still be put on the table. That really leaves nobody in society who both wants a functioning nation and can afford to pay for it. Really leaves nobody in society who both wants a functioning nation and can afford to pay for it. Sure, it's true that corporations and the super-rich can be taxed, but that's not enough. There's a reason that Europe and Canada ask people to pay higher taxes to support a better social contract. That's the only way such a contract is sustainable. You can't get there from a one-off tax on corporations and the rich alone. It's also true that if America were to build a better social contract with good healthcare and retirement, etc., everyone's bills would decline over time. But that doesn't solve the problem, which is that Americans can't afford the costs in the first place. Sure, if America had public health care, people wouldn't have to pay $10,000 per person per year for it. But such is the reality, and someone's not going to raise their incomes by that much if they don't pay that amount. Corporate America's not going to give anyone a raise because it's paying less in healthcare costs. That's why all the plans for overhauling America's broken public healthcare system continue to involve employers paying into some kind of trust fund. Nobody wants to give people more money. But without giving people more money, Americans will remain too poor to live in anything but the collapsing society America's become. If that doesn't make sense to you, just think about it in your own life. Could you really afford to lose 10% of your income right about now? Ever. You lose most or everything you have. There goes the mortgage, the school, the credit rating, and so on. The plainer economic translation of that is, you're too poor to afford a functioning society. You can barely support your own. How can you support everyone else? This begs the question as to how America was left too poor to afford anything but collapse. In Europe and Canada, there was a certain kind of fairness that came to prevail. People pay about half their incomes in taxes, half for me, half for everyone else. But that also implies that society's surplus is distributed far more equitably in the first place. That half you pay in taxes goes to employ doctors, nurses, professors, public servants of all. That half you pay in taxes goes to employ doctors, nurses, professors, public servants of all kinds that simply don't exist in America. It's used to invest in hospitals, schools, universities, parks, libraries every single year. That's been happening for something like 50 years by now, a cycle of equitable redistribution that became sustained investment and reinvestment. What happens if you invest in an entity such as a park, a hospital, or a library for 50 years? It gets better and better. Its returns and grow and grow. There's more of everything to go around for everyone. The battle for self-preservation doesn't lock people into poverty, as it does in America. That's what it means to be a truly rich society. America's been doing exactly the opposite for the same 50 years and longer. Do you see any reinvestment in anything? Everything's decrepit, from airports to schools to libraries, precisely because there hasn't been any reinvestment. There has been insufficient investment because Americans didn't want to pay those higher taxes, which Europeans and Canadians did. They believed the strange, foolish, and evidence-free ideologies of trickle-down economics and neoliberalism and all the rest of it. We'll all be richest if we invest in precisely nothing together. Nobody should care about anybody else. Nobody should ever support anyone else in the pursuit of anything. Life was to be purely individualistic, adversarial, and acquisitive. That way of thinking led Americans straight into a poverty trap. They were paying lower taxes, sure, but their public goods were decaying. Their common wealth was eroding. Their systems and institutions were corroding. Think about what happens to metal that isn't polished, a street that's never cleaned, a house that's never repaired. Well, in the end, you have to pay a bigger bill. But you might not be able to afford it at all by then. Bang! Then you're done. You live in that crumbling house until it finally turns to dust. If you can't pay the roofer, plumber, electrician, that's where America is now. Do you know spending most of their income on low-quality food, transportation, medicine, and so on, because it's all they can afford? That's where America is now. From a global perspective, in a classic poverty trap. Too poor ever to afford to be rich again because the country doesn't have the money to invest in its own self-improvement now. Decades of underinvestment mean that there was less and less to go around until American life became a brutal daily battle for self-preservation. But when all you can do is barely even struggle to preserve yourself, put food on the table, keep your family afloat, you don't have much left to give back to a better society. As in nothing. And it's borne out by America's spectacularly low or negative savings rate, i.e., everyone but the mega-rich dies in debt. To achieve European or Canadian living standards, it's impossible to imagine how much America would have to invest now. Think of it. Gleaming hospitals for everyone, thriving public squares, expansive childcare, good retirement, jobs that pay the bills. Oversight of it all. It would take billions or trillions. Probably dozens of trillions. Much, much more than average Americans all put together can afford to spend now. Those are the brutal economics of collapse. Societies which let themselves become poor can hardly wave a magic wand and become rich. Societies which let themselves become poor can hardly wave a magic wand and become rich. What it means to be a poor society, which is what America's become, is also the experience of life in it by now. Political chaos, economic ruin, emotional paralysis, cultural degeneration. Europe and Canada, again, have been investing in life for decades, while America's been ignoring it. The result is that they are ahead now, and America can probably never catch up. America let itself become a poor society, and this, the chaos and dislocation of now, is what it means to be one. I know this sounds very grim. It's terrible and horrific. But my job at the wake-up call is to do a job that the typical pundit won't, which is to try to tell you simple truths. The one that economics tells me is this: it's too late for America to recover. It left it too long. It was arrogant and conceited, paying for things it didn't need, like wars and mega mansions, but not for those it did. So it didn't invest when it should have done, but now the bill is due. Yet nobody can pay it. What do you call a society like that? Bankrupt. Just like most Americans are, only they don't know it. What do you call a whole society of people, after all, who die in debt? America's broke, my friends, and when you're broke, you will ring a bell.